Throughout college, Eric was that guy. The one everyone wanted to know, the one professors went easy on, and the one who always seemed to get away with everything. He was effortlessly charming, with a crooked grin that masked his cruelty. People flocked to him, hypnotized by his magnetic energy, but I had the misfortune of seeing what lay beneath the polished exterior. Eric had a way of sniffing out vulnerabilities, and once he found them, he didn't just exploit them. He fed on them. For reasons I never understood, I became his favorite prey. I wasn't a stereotype by any means. I wasn't bookish or reclusive, nor was I outspoken enough to provoke his attention. I was just me. Average grades, a handful of close friends, and a determination to graduate on time and start my life. I wasn't invisible, but I wasn't noteworthy either. That, apparently, was enough to offend Eric. He thrived on chaos, and I wasn't giving him the reaction he craved. I didn't laugh at his jokes when he humiliated others. I didn't stammer or shrink away when he threw insults my way. Instead, I stayed calm, detached even, which seemed to fuel his obsession. At first, it was annoying more than anything. Sarcastic comments in passing, eye rolls when I answer questions in class, and the occasional rumor whispered just loud enough for me to overhear. But as the months passed, his behavior escalated. By sophomore year, he had graduated to outright sabotage. I'll never forget the day he claimed I plagiarized my portion of a group project. A baseless accusation, but one he delivered with such confidence that our professor believed him. The project was tanked, and my reputation took a hit. Later, when I confronted Eric in the library, he smirked and said, "Don't take it personally. You just make it too easy." Eric wasn't alone in his torment. He had a posse of sycophants who followed him everywhere, eager to join in on the fun. Each of them brought their own flavor of cruelty to the table. There was Jason, the loudmouth who loved to make a spectacle, Brianna, who weaponized gossip like a sniper, and Marcus, the muscle who ensured no one challenged Eric directly. Together, they were a storm, and I was often caught in the eye of it. One incident stands out even now. It was the day of an important presentation for my business ethics class, a class Eric and I unfortunately shared. I had spent weeks preparing, and I was confident in my material. But when it came time for me to present, my flash drive was nowhere to be found. Panic set in as I rifled through my bag, knowing I had double-checked it that morning. Then I saw Eric, sitting in the back row, spinning a familiar-looking flash drive between his fingers. He made eye contact, winked, and tossed it into the air like a coin. I failed that presentation, and when I confronted the professor afterward, all I got was a sympathetic shrug. "Eric's father just donated a new computer lab," he said quietly. "You understand, don't you?" My mom was beside herself when I told her what had been happening. "Transfer," she begged. "Please, you don't have to stay there." But transferring wasn't an option, not when I was already halfway through my degree. I couldn't stomach the thought of starting over at a new school, explaining to admissions offices why I'd left, and losing the progress I'd made. "It's just one more year," I reassured her. "I'll get through it." But inside, I wasn't so sure. Every day felt like a battle. I'd walk into classrooms knowing Eric was waiting for me, ready to pull some new stunt or dredge up a fresh insult. My friends tried to help, but even they were cautious. Eric's influence extended far beyond his circle, and no one wanted to be his next target. Looking back, what scared me most wasn't the things Eric did to me. It was how powerless I felt to stop him. His father's money shielded him from consequences. Professors, deans, even campus security turned a blind eye to his antics. And the worst part? Eric knew it. He carried himself with the arrogance of someone who believed the world existed solely to serve him. And for a while, it seemed like he was right. Still, I refused to let him break me. Every insult, every humiliation, every stolen opportunity only hardened my resolve. I kept my head down, focused on my studies, and told myself that one day, this would all be behind me. Little did I know, Eric's grip on my life would loosen eventually, but not before he left a permanent mark. By the time senior year rolled around, I had perfected the art of survival. Eric and his band of enablers no longer made me flinch. They were just an unavoidable nuisance in the background of my life. The pranks, the whispers, the pointed stares, it all became white noise. I was laser-focused on one thing, walking across that stage and getting my diploma. Nothing else mattered. Eric, on the other hand, had grown bolder in his disregard for academics. He treated classes as optional, breezing in late or skipping altogether. He flaunted his connections openly, making sure everyone knew his father's influence could smooth over any obstacles in his path. Rumors started circulating that his dad had made a massive donation to the university, conveniently timed right before Eric's abysmal grades would have landed him on academic probation. The administration kept quiet, but the sudden announcement of a new wing being added to the business school spoke volumes. At first, I was furious at the injustice of it all. Eric didn't deserve to graduate, not after coasting through years of school on the coattails of his wealth and privilege. But as the months wore on, I realized I didn't care anymore. Whether he graduated or not, whether he went on to inherit his father's empire or crashed and burned, his life had no bearing on mine. I just needed to finish what I started and move on. Graduation day felt surreal. The campus buzzed with excitement as students in caps and gowns posed for photos, surrounded by proud families. I stood on the edges of the celebration, clutching my diploma like it was a lifeline. For the first time in 4 years, I felt a glimmer of hope, a sense that I could finally leave all the pain and humiliation behind. Eric was there, of course, holding court in the middle of a large group of friends and admirers. He was dressed impeccably, his confidence as unshakable as ever. I tried to avoid looking in his direction, but our eyes met briefly across the crowd. For a moment, it felt like time froze. His expression was unreadable, half a smirk, half something else I couldn't quite place. I thought he might say something, but he didn't. Instead, he turned back to his group, laughing at something one of them said. That was the last time I saw him. As I walked away from the ceremony, diploma in hand, I made a silent promise to myself. Eric would never take up space in my mind again. He was a chapter one was closing for good. Life after college was anything but glamorous. I didn't have a cushy safety net or a powerful last name to fall back on, so I hustled. My first job was at a small, unremarkable law firm where I spent most of my time buried in paperwork and doing the grunt work no one else wanted to touch. The pay was terrible, the hours long, but I kept my head down and learned everything I could. Every late night at the office, every missed weekend, every ounce of effort, it all went toward one goal, building something of my own. After a few years, I finally took the leap and started my own practice. It wasn't easy. Clients didn't exactly come flooding in at first, but slowly I began to make a name for myself. I specialized in business litigation, the kind of high-stakes cases that demanded precision and nerves of steel. My reputation grew, and so did my firm. By the time I hit my mid-30s, I had a small but successful team working under me and a roster of high-profile clients that kept the lights on, and then some. Eric became a distant memory, a ghost from a life I had worked hard to leave behind. I didn't keep tabs on him, didn't Google his name late at night, didn't wonder where he was or what he was doing. If I thought about him at all, it was as a reminder of how far I had come, proof that resilience could outlast privilege. But life is a way of throwing curveballs when you least expect them. One afternoon, as I was reviewing case notes in my office, my assistant buzzed through the intercom. "There's someone here to see you," she said. "No appointment, but he's insistent. Says it's urgent." "Who is it?" I asked, already annoyed. She hesitated. "His name is Eric. Eric Whitmore." The name hit me like a punch to the gut. For a second, I thought I must have misheard her. Eric Whitmore? That Eric? I hadn't seen or heard from him in a decade. What could he possibly want? "Send him in," I said, my voice steady despite the unease creeping into my chest. The door opened, and there he was, but he wasn't the Eric I remembered. The confident swagger was gone, replaced by an awkward hesitance. His once sharp suit was wrinkled and ill-fitting, his face gaunt, his eyes hollow. He looked desperate. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The air in the room felt heavy, charged with the weight of unspoken history. Finally, he broke the silence. "Hey," he said, his voice quieter than I expected. "Long time no see." I leaned back in my chair, folding my arms. "Eric Whitmore," I said, letting the name hang in the air. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" He fidgeted, avoiding my gaze. I need your help." I raised an eyebrow. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on me. 10 years ago, this man had made it his mission to tear me down. And now he was sitting in my office, asking for my help. It was a moment I'd imagined countless times, but now that it was happening, I didn't know what to feel. Satisfaction? Anger? Pity? I settled for silence, waiting for him to explain himself. Eric took a deep breath, his voice trembling slightly. "I know I'm probably the last person you want to see right now, but I'm in trouble, big trouble, and you're the only person I can think of who might actually care." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. I studied his face, trying to reconcile the broken man in front of me with the arrogant bully I had known in college. For the first time in years, I felt the past claw its way back to the surface. Eric Whitmore needed me, and I wasn't sure if I was ready to hear why. The door creaked open, and Eric Whitmore stepped inside. For a moment, the past slammed into me like a freight train. He was thinner now, his confident posture replaced by a slouched hesitance. Eric had always been larger than life, a walking embodiment of privilege and arrogance. But the man standing before me looked like a ghost of his former self. His once pristine suits had been replaced by a crumpled blazer and mismatched tie, and the shadows under his eyes told a story of sleepless nights and relentless stress. He stopped just inside the room, scanning the office as if trying to ground himself. His gaze lingered on the gold nameplate on my desk. My name, managing partner. The recognition in his eyes was instant, and so was the dread. "Eric," I said evenly, leaning back in my chair. "Long time no see." He flinched, just barely, and then tried to summon a smile, the same charming smirk he used to wear like armor. But it fell flat, sagging under the weight of whatever had brought him here. "Hey," he said, his voice quieter than I'd ever heard it. "I guess you probably remember me. Remember him?" His laugh still echoed in the corners of my mind. His cruel pranks still lingered in the shadows of my memory. I remembered every cutting word, every stolen moment of dignity. But I didn't show it. Instead, I gestured toward the chair across from me, keeping my expression neutral. "Have a seat." He hesitated, then sat down with a sigh, his movements slow and deliberate. For a few seconds, he just stared at the polished surface of my desk, as if gathering the courage to speak. Finally, he looked up, his eyes hollow but searching. "I need your help," he said, "and I know I don't deserve it." I didn't reply immediately, letting the words hang in the air. He shifted uncomfortably under my gaze, his hands fidgeting with the edge of his blazer. "You probably think it's karma," he added after a moment, forcing out a nervous laugh. "And maybe it is. But I'm out of options." His voice cracked slightly on the last word, and for the first time, I saw something I'd never associated with Eric Whitmore: vulnerability. It was almost enough to stir pity. Almost. I folded my hands in front of me and said, "Why don't you start from the beginning?" He nodded, swallowing hard. "My father, he's always been ruthless. I knew that growing up, but I thought it was just business. I thought it didn't apply to me." He gave a bitter laugh, shaking his head. "Turns out I was wrong. He stripped me of everything: my inheritance, my stake in the family business, even access to the trust fund my mom set up for me before she died. He froze my accounts, framed me for fraud, and blacklisted me in every professional circle that matters." The words spilled out in a rush, his voice tinged with desperation. He was unraveling right there in my office, and I wasn't sure how to feel about it. On one hand, it was satisfying to see the man who had once tormented me brought so low. On the other hand, this was real. His pain, his panic, it wasn't an act. "He's got connections everywhere," Eric continued, running a hand through his disheveled hair. "No one will take my case. No one will even hear me out. But I heard about your firm. I know you're good. I thought maybe you could help me." The irony was almost poetic. The man who had gone out of his way to make my life hell was now sitting in my office, begging for my expertise. I leaned back in my chair, studying him carefully. He couldn't meet my gaze for long, his eyes darting to the bookshelves, the window, the floor, anywhere but at me. "So let me get this straight," I said finally, my voice calm but deliberate. "You want me to help you take down your father? The same father who shielded you from every consequence you should have faced in college. The same father whose influence you used to sabotage people like me." Eric winced, the color draining from his face. He opened his mouth to respond but faltered, his words catching in his throat. I could see the weight of my words settling on him, the realization of just how much history hung between us. "Do you even want to help me?" he asked suddenly, his voice sharp and defensive. His tone caught me off guard. It was the first glimpse of the old Eric, the one who used to wield his entitlement like a weapon. But it didn't last. His shoulders slumped, and he added softly, "I wouldn't blame you if you didn't." The vulnerability in his voice disarmed me, but I didn't let it show. Instead, I let the silence stretch, watching him squirm. He looked like a man teetering on the edge, desperate for a lifeline, but too proud to admit how close he was to falling. "I haven't decided yet," I said finally, keeping my tone neutral. "But if I do agree to take your case, it won't be because I've forgotten the past. It'll be because I believe in justice, even for people who might not deserve it." Eric nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. "That's fair," he said. "I don't expect forgiveness. I need someone who isn't afraid of my father. Someone who knows how to fight people like him." I studied him for a long moment, weighing my options. Part of me wanted to send him packing, to let him deal with the consequences of his own arrogance and privilege. But another part of me, the part that had built my career on fighting for the underdog, hesitated. This wasn't just about Eric. It was about taking on a man who had wielded his power to destroy lives, including his own son's. "I'll think about it," I said finally, standing to signal the end of the meeting. Eric rose unsteadily, looking like he wanted to say more, but deciding against it. As he turned to leave, he paused in the doorway, glancing back at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "Thank you," he said quietly, and then he was gone. I sank back into my chair, staring at the door long after it had closed. My mind raced with questions, doubts, and a lingering unease. Eric Whitmore had come back into my life, dragging a storm of complications with him. And for the first time in years, I wasn't sure what the right move was. The second meeting felt more deliberate, more charged. Eric walked in without hesitation this time, though his unease was still palpable. He had a folder tucked under his arm and a look in his eyes that I couldn't quite place, a mix of desperation and determination. Whatever had brought him here wasn't just a sob story. It was something heavier, something real. I didn't offer him a seat this time. I stayed standing behind my desk, watching him as he fidgeted with the folder. "So," I said, breaking the silence, "let's start with the basics. Do you remember me?" Eric froze, his expression suddenly guarded. His face flushed a deep red, and for a moment, I thought he might deny it. But then he sighed, dropping his gaze to the floor. "Yeah," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Yeah, I do." His admission caught me off guard. I had expected deflection, an excuse, maybe even an attempt to downplay what he'd done. But there was a crack in the armor. For the first time, I saw something that resembled shame on his face. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the desk, waiting for him to continue. He hesitated, his hands gripping the edges of the folder. "I was a total piece of sh*t back then. I know that. I made your life hell. And for what? To feel bigger? Stronger? I don't even know anymore." He laughed bitterly, shaking his head. "Life has a way of teaching you, though. Trust me, I've learned." I wanted to scoff, to call him out on how convenient his epiphany was now that he needed something from me. But there was a rawness in his voice that stopped me. It wasn't the Eric I remembered, the one who reveled in chaos, who wore his cruelty like a badge of honor. This man looked genuinely broken. Still, the bitterness in me wasn't so easily quieted. "You've changed," I said, my tone sharp and skeptical. "That's what you're going with." Eric flinched but didn't back down. "Yeah," he said, meeting my eyes for the first time. "I've changed. Life humbled me." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. I wanted to believe he was lying, that this was just another manipulation, another game. But his eyes told a different story. They were tired, hollow, and weighed down by something I couldn't yet name. "Do you know what it was like?" he continued, his voice rising slightly. "To have everything ripped away? To go from being the guy everyone envied to being nothing? It's like the ground disappeared beneath me, and I've been free-falling ever since." I studied him, my mind racing. This wasn't the Eric I knew, not entirely. He wasn't groveling, but he wasn't smug either. He seemed raw, vulnerable, and for a moment, I wondered if he was telling the truth. Eric slid the folder across the desk, his movements slow and deliberate. "I don't expect sympathy," he said, his voice steady. "But I need you to look at this. Just look. If you can't help, I'll walk away. No hard feelings." I picked up the folder, more out of curiosity than anything else. It was thicker than I expected, filled with legal documents, financial statements, and handwritten letters. The top page was a detailed timeline of events. Accusations of fraud, embezzlement, and breaches of fiduciary duty, all aimed squarely at Eric. Each bullet point painted a picture of a man systematically destroyed by his own father. "Start with the letters," Eric said quietly. "They explain everything." I flipped to the section he mentioned, my eyes skimming the first page. The handwriting was neat and formal, but the words were venomous. The letters weren't just legal correspondence. They were personal attacks, written by Eric's father himself. They detailed Eric's failures, his incompetence, and his ungrateful nature. They outlined how his father had orchestrated Eric's downfall, using his connections to blacklist him from every major business in the industry. "Why?" I asked, my voice sharp. "Why would he do this to you?" Eric laughed bitterly. "Because I stood up to him. I told him I didn't want to run the family business his way. I wanted to take it in a different direction, make it more transparent, less cutthroat. He saw that as a betrayal. And if there's one thing my father doesn't tolerate, it's betrayal." I flipped through the rest of the folder, my stomach twisting as the pieces began to fall into place. His father hadn't just taken away Eric's wealth and status. He had systematically destroyed every aspect of his life. It was calculated, cruel, and disturbingly thorough. "And this is why you came to me," I said, finally closing the folder. Eric nodded. "You're the only one who can help me. Everyone else is too scared of him, or they're on his payroll. But you built this firm from nothing. You don't owe anyone anything, and you're not afraid to fight." The irony wasn't lost on me. The man who had once thrived on my misery was now sitting in front of me, pleading for my help. I wasn't sure whether to feel vindicated or disgusted. Maybe both. I leaned back in my chair, my mind racing. If I took this case, it wouldn't just be about Eric. It would be about taking on a man who had used his power to ruin lives, including his own sons. But could I really help Eric after everything he'd done to me? And more importantly, did I want to? "I'll think about it," I said finally, standing to signal the end of the meeting. Eric nodded, his expression a mix of relief and resignation. "Thank you," he said quietly. "That's all I can ask." As he left the office, I sat back down and stared at the folder in front of me. The weight of the past and present collided, leaving me with more questions than answers. Helping Eric might have been the right thing to do, but after everything we'd been through, I wasn't sure if I could. The office was quiet, save for the faint hum of the air conditioning. I sat at my desk, the folder Eric had left sitting in front of me like a sealed Pandora's box. For a moment, I debated leaving it unopened, letting it remain just another artifact of his chaos. But curiosity, and maybe a faint sense of responsibility, won out. With a sigh, I flipped it open. The first thing I saw was a financial statement. Eric's accounts, frozen and emptied, showed a clear trail leading back to his father's holding company. The sums weren't small, millions siphoned out over a matter of weeks. Attached was a letter from his father's lawyer, thinly veiled as a notice of compliance. But the subtext was clear. Eric was being cut off completely and irrevocably. I moved on to the next document, a court summons accusing Eric of embezzlement and fraud during his tenure as CEO of one of his father's subsidiaries. The charges, on paper, looked damning: misappropriation of funds, falsified expense reports, and suspicious offshore accounts. But as I read deeper, the inconsistencies began to show. The alleged misappropriations coincided with periods when Eric wasn't even involved with the company, and the accounts tied to his name were traced back to shell companies directly under his father's control. It was a masterclass in character assassination, not just a financial dismantling, but a complete erosion of Eric's professional reputation. His father hadn't just taken his money, he'd turned him into a pariah in the business world. I set the financial documents aside and moved on to the personal letters. The handwriting was meticulous, each line sharp and precise, like the words themselves could cut. "You think you're entitled to the empire I built?" One letter read. "You've done nothing to earn it. Your weakness disgusts me. I gave you everything, and this is how you repay me. With disobedience? With arrogance? You are a failure, Eric. Nothing more." Another letter detailed his father's belief that Eric had humiliated the family by attempting to take the company in a softer direction. Eric's plans to modernize and implement ethical practices weren't seen as progressive. They were seen as treason. The letters were searing, personal in a way that made my chest tighten. They weren't just business grievances. They were emotional grenades designed to destroy. It painted a picture of a man who thrived on control, who demanded absolute loyalty, and who would stop at nothing to maintain his power. It was disturbingly familiar. Too familiar. For a moment, I was back in that university classroom, hearing Eric's voice echo in my mind. The way he used to call me worthless, the way he thrived on making me feel small. It was all there in those letters, just in a different voice. His father had crushed him in the same way Eric had once crushed me. The same tactics, the same venom. For the briefest of moments, I felt a flicker of pity. But then I reminded myself of who I was dealing with. Eric Whitmore, the man who had made my life a living hell for years. The man who had weaponized his privilege and connections to tear me down at every opportunity. The man who even now could be spinning another web to manipulate me into cleaning up his mess. Could I trust him? Or was this just another elaborate scheme? Another way to shift blame and escape accountability? My mind raced with questions, doubts clawing at the edges of my resolve. I glanced at the closed door of my office, half expecting Eric to barge back in, demanding answers. But the room was still. The only thing staring back at me was the open folder and the damning contents within. Eric's story was compelling. Too compelling, maybe, The meticulous way his father had orchestrated his downfall mirrored the precision Eric once used to torment me. It was almost poetic in a way, but I couldn't ignore the nagging voice in the back of my mind, the one that warned me against jumping to conclusions. Eric had lied before. What if this was just another lie, crafted so carefully that even I couldn't see through it? I leaned back in my chair, rubbing my temples. This wasn't just a legal puzzle to solve. It was a moral quandary. Could I bring myself to help Eric, knowing what he had done to me? Could I put aside years of resentment to take on a case that might genuinely deserve my attention? As I stared at the folder, the weight of the decision pressed down on me. This wasn't just about Eric. It was about justice, real justice. But it was also about trust, and whether or not I could believe the man who had once thrived on my misery had truly changed. For the first time in a long while, I wasn't sure what to do. The next morning, Eric was back in my office. He looked slightly more composed this time, though the weight of his situation was still etched into his face. He waited as I closed the folder on my desk, and for a moment, we just stared at each other. The silence was heavy, pregnant with the unspoken history between us. Finally, I leaned forward, folding my hands on the desk. "Why me?" I asked, my tone measured but firm. "There are hundreds of lawyers in this city, probably thousands. Why come to someone you used to torment?" Eric flinched slightly, but to his credit, he didn't look away. He took a deep breath, as if steadying himself, and said, "Because I know you're good." And he hesitated, his voice dropping. "And because I need someone who doesn't owe my dad anything." It wasn't the answer I expected, and it unsettled me more than any excuse he could have given. There was no bravado in his voice, no attempt to spin the situation in his favor. It was just raw, unvarnished truth. For a moment, I felt a flicker of something I couldn't quite name. Respect? Pity? I wasn't sure. "Your dad's influence really goes that far?" I asked, leaning back in my chair. Eric laughed bitterly. "You have no idea. He has everyone in his pocket. Judges, lawyers, accountants, even reporters. The minute anyone tries to help me, he shuts them down, either with threats, bribes, or outright blackmail. I'm toxic, and no one wants to get involved." He rubbed a hand over his face, exhaustion evident in every line of his body. "But you've got nothing to lose by taking this case. You built your own firm. You don't answer to anyone." His words hung in the air, and I couldn't deny the logic. He was right. I had no ties to his father, no strings that could be pulled to manipulate me. I had fought hard for my independence, and no amount of influence could sway me. But that wasn't the only reason he was sitting in front of me. We both knew it. "You said something else yesterday," I said, keeping my tone neutral. "You said you've changed. That life humbled you. Why should I believe that?" Eric didn't answer immediately. He stared at the floor, his jaw tightening. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, almost a whisper. "You probably shouldn't. Not yet, anyway. But I'm trying. I'm trying to be better. And I know I can't do that without facing my past." He looked up then, meeting my gaze with an intensity that caught me off guard. "That includes you." It was a good answer. Too good, maybe. I studied him, searching for cracks, but all I saw was sincerity. Or at least something close to it. My mind raced, weighing my options. Taking his case would be the ultimate power move, a chance to prove I was the better person, the one who could rise above the past. But it also meant letting him off the hook for everything he'd done. Did he deserve that? "You realize what you're asking me to do?" I said finally. "You're asking me to put aside years of everything, to go to war against your father on your behalf. You're asking me to trust you." "I know," Eric said quietly, "and I don't expect you to decide right away. Just think about it." I sighed, leaning back in my chair. The weight of his request pressed down on me, heavy and unrelenting. Part of me wanted to say no, to walk away and let him deal with the mess he'd made of his life. But another part, the part that had built a career on fighting for the underdog, hesitated. "I'll think about it," I said finally, standing to signal the end of our meeting. Eric stood too, nodding slightly. "Thank you," he said, his voice sincere. "I mean it." As he left, I sat back down and stared at the folder on my desk. Helping Eric would mean revisiting wounds I'd spent years trying to forget. It would mean walking a fine line between justice and vengeance, between mercy and accountability. And as much as I hated to admit it, I wasn't sure if I was ready to make that choice. That night, sleep was out of the question. My mind wouldn't shut off, replaying Eric's words from earlier in the day. "I'm trying to be better. That includes you." It echoed like a broken record, twisting in my head alongside memories I had worked so hard to bury. The anger I thought I'd left behind began to simmer again, surfacing in flashes of humiliation and hurt. One memory hit me harder than the rest. It was sophomore year, just before an important business ethics exam. I've been studying for weeks, desperate to ace it and keep my GPA intact. The stakes were high, too high for games. But Eric didn't care. That morning, as I arrived at class early to settle my nerves, he and his friends cornered me in the hallway. "Hey, Brainiac," he'd said, his grin sharp and smug. "Big day, huh?" Feeling the pressure. Before I could respond, they pushed me into an open supply closet, slamming the door shut and barricading it from the outside. I yelled, pounded on the door, begged to be let out. But all I heard was their laughter fading down the hall. By the time someone found me, the exam was over and I'd failed by default. My professor had offered a hollow apology, explaining that Eric's playful nature was just part of who he was. "Don't let it get to you," he'd said, as if that was supposed to make it better. The humiliation had burned like acid, but what stayed with me most was the laughter. The sheer delight Eric had taken in watching me panic. Could I really help this man? The same man who had locked me in that closet? The one who'd spread lies about me, sabotaged my work, and turned me into a punchline? Or would helping him be a betrayal? Not just of the younger version of myself, but of the resilience I'd fought so hard to build? I paced my apartment, the polished wood floor creaking under my steps. Vindication and mercy wrestled in my chest, each one demanding to be heard. Helping him could be the ultimate victory, a chance to prove that I was above his pettiness. But it could also feel like letting him win, like erasing the pain he'd caused with the stroke of a pen. The rational part of me argued that Eric's father was the real enemy here. The man in those letters was monstrous, a tyrant who had destroyed his own son for daring to challenge his authority. But another part of me, the part that still bore the scars Eric had left, wasn't ready to let go. I stopped pacing and leaned against the window, staring out at the city lights. The world outside my apartment seemed so vast, so distant from the small, suffocating bubble Eric had created during our college years. I had fought hard to escape that bubble, to build a life where his shadow couldn't reach me. But now, here he was barging back into my life and dragging me into his chaos once again. As much as I wanted to leave him to his fate, something about his story kept pulling me back. It wasn't just the legal intrigue, though that part was compelling in its own right. It was the vulnerability I'd seen in his eyes, the way he'd admitted to his mistakes, the way he'd asked for my help without demanding it. Had he really changed? Or was this just another manipulation, another power play disguised as humility? The uncertainty gnawed at me, leaving me restless and unsettled. I crossed the room and picked up the folder he'd left behind. Opening it again, I skimmed through the letters, the court documents, the financial statements. Each page painted a clearer picture of a man who had been systematically dismantled by his father's ruthless machinations. It was hard not to feel a twinge of sympathy, even if the man in question was Eric Whitmore. But sympathy wasn't enough. I needed clarity. I needed to know if helping him was the right thing to do, or if it was just another trap. And until I figured that out, sleep would remain out of reach. The next morning, the weight of indecision still hung over me like a storm cloud. I couldn't shake the memories of what Eric had done, but I also couldn't ignore the evidence of what his father had done to him. I needed a second opinion, someone who could offer perspective without the burden of my personal history. So I picked up my phone and called Clara. Clara and I had been close in college, bonded by our shared experiences as outsiders in a world dominated by people like Eric. She'd been there for most of his cruelest stunts, a quiet witness who offered support when I needed it most. We hadn't spoken in years, but I knew she'd pick up. She always did. When her familiar voice came through the line, I felt a flicker of comfort. Well, she said, teasingly. To what do I owe the honor of this blast from the past? I didn't waste time on small talk. Clara, do you remember Eric Whitmore? Her laugh was immediate and sharp. Oh, I remember. Why? Did he finally get what was coming to him? I hesitated, unsure how to frame the situation. He showed up at my office. He's in trouble. Big trouble. And he wants me to help him. Clara listened as I explained the details. The financial sabotage, the legal accusations, the personal letters that painted a picture of a man broken by his father's cruelty. I told her everything, from the desperation in Eric's voice to my own conflicted feelings about taking his case. When I finished, there was a long pause on the other end of the line. Finally, she spoke, her tone heavy with skepticism. So, let me get this straight. The guy who made our lives a living hell is now begging for your help? That's rich. I could almost see the smirk on her face, but then her tone softened. Look, I'm not going to tell you what to do. But if you're asking me whether I think he deserves your help, I don't know. Probably not. Karma's a be asterisk tsich, and it sounds like she's doing her job. But, she added, her voice thoughtful, maybe helping him is the ultimate revenge. Show him what real power looks like. You're not the same person he tormented back then. You've built something he can't touch. And if you help him, he'll owe you. Forever. Her words hit like a gut punch. Was mercy really the most fitting punishment? The idea of Eric, humbled and indebted to me, was strangely satisfying. But there was another side to it, one that felt less righteous. Would helping him absolve him of his past? Would it erase the years of pain he'd caused, simply because he was in a worse position now? You think I should take the case? I asked finally, my voice uncertain. I think, Clara said slowly, you should do what you can live with. If it feels like you're betraying yourself or the person you used to be, then don't do it. But if you can look him in the eye and know you've won, even as you help him, then maybe it's worth it. Her words stuck with me long after we hung up. Clara had always been sharp, unflinching in her opinions, but this was different. She wasn't telling me what to do. She was giving me a mirror, forcing me to confront my own motivations. I spent the rest of the day mulling over her advice, replaying her words in my head. Could I really help Eric without losing a piece of myself in the process? Or was this my chance to finally hold the power, to prove that I had risen above everything he'd tried to tear down? By the time the sun set, I still didn't have an answer. But I knew one thing for sure. Whatever decision I made, it wouldn't be simple. Eric walked into my office a week later, looking even worse than before. His shoulders were hunched, his face gaunt, and his clothes hung awkwardly on his frame, as if he'd lost even more weight. He carried an air of quiet desperation that filled the room the moment the door clicked shut. I watched him silently as he approached the chair across from my desk, sitting down with a weariness that seemed to seep from his very bones. He looked at me, not with the entitled confidence I remembered from college, but with the cautious hope of someone teetering on the edge of ruin. I didn't think you'd call me back, he admitted, his voice hoarse. Thanks for seeing me again. I didn't respond immediately. Instead, I opened the folder he'd left with me and flipped through the pages one last time. I could feel his eyes on me, searching for some clue to what I was thinking, but I kept my expression unreadable. Finally, I pushed the folder across the desk toward him. I'll take your case, I said evenly. His eyes widened with surprise, and for a moment, he looked like he might cry. Thank you, he breathed. Thank you. But I interrupted, holding up a hand. There's a condition. The flicker of hope in his eyes wavered. Anything, he said quickly, leaning forward as if to prove his sincerity. Whatever you need, just tell me. I met his gaze, my voice steady but firm. You'll make amends. For everything. Every person you hurt. Every bridge you burned. You'll do the work to set it right. His face fell, and for a moment, I thought he might walk out. He leaned back in his chair, his jaw tightening as he stared at the desk in front of him. The silence stretched, heavy with unspoken tension. I know what you're thinking, I said. That this is just me getting back at you. And maybe part of it is. But this isn't just about me, Eric. It's about proving that you've actually changed. That you're not the same person you used to be. He looked up at me then, his expression conflicted. Do you really think that'll make a difference? Even if I apologize to every person I've ever hurt, it won't undo what I've done. No, I agreed. It won't. But it'll prove you're willing to take responsibility. That's more than you've ever done before. Eric was quiet for a long time, his hands clenched in a fist on his lap. I could see the war raging inside him, the part of him that wanted to resist clashing with the part that knew he didn't have a choice. Finally, he nodded, his voice barely above a whisper. I'll do it, whatever it takes. The words hung in the air, and for the first time, I believed him. There was no arrogance, no bravado, just a man who had been humbled by life and was trying, however clumsily, to find his way back. All right, I said, leaning back in my chair. Here's how this works. I'll take on your case, but you'll follow my lead. No cutting corners, no half measures. If I find out you've lied to me or gone back on your word, the deal's off. Understood? He nodded again, more firmly this time. Understood. Good. I stood, signaling the end of the meeting. Eric rose too, looking slightly steadier than when he'd arrived. He extended a hand, and after a brief hesitation, I shook it. Thank you, he said again, his voice filled with quiet sincerity. I won't let you down. I didn't respond, watching as he turned and walked out of the office. As the door closed behind him, I sank back into my chair, my thoughts a whirlwind of doubt and determination. Taking his case was a risk, not just professionally, but personally. It forced me to confront parts of myself I wasn't sure I was ready to face. But as I stared at the now empty folder on my desk, I realized that I wasn't just fighting for Eric. I was fighting for myself, too, for the chance to prove that I was stronger than the person he used to be and that the past no longer had the power to define me. The case was more grueling than I expected. Months of depositions, motions, and sleepless nights buried under mountains of evidence. Eric's father, James Whitmore, had a legal team that could have intimidated even the most seasoned litigators. They fought us at every turn, throwing up roadblocks and red tape, but we pressed forward. To Eric's credit, he held up his end of the deal, at least at first. He reached out to old classmates, former colleagues, and others he'd heard along the way. Some accepted his apologies with cautious optimism. Others laughed in his face, and a few refused to even speak to him. Still, he didn't stop. He even began donating to causes that would have made the old Eric roll his eyes. Scholarships for underprivileged students, funding for anti-bullying programs. For a while, it seemed like he was genuinely trying. But as the trial approached, the cracks started to show. It began subtly. Sharp comments muttered under his breath when depositions didn't go his way, visible frustration when things didn't happen on his timeline. Then there were the moments that felt like déjà vu. The dismissive tone when talking to junior staff, the slight smirk of superiority when he thought no one was looking. Arrogance, impatience, entitlement. They all resurfaced bit by bit as the pressure mounted. One afternoon, after a particularly grueling meeting, I pulled him aside. "Eric," I said sharply, "what are you doing?" He blinked at me, feigning innocence. "What do you mean?" "You're slipping," I said. "That tone, that attitude, it's the same crap you used to pull in college. Do you want to sabotage everything we've built here?" His face hardened, the flicker of the old Eric flashing in his eyes. But then he sighed, deflating like a punctured balloon. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "It's just this is my life on the line. I'm scared." I wanted to believe him, and maybe part of me did. But another part couldn't shake the feeling that I was seeing the real Eric, the one who still thought the world owed him something. When the trial finally began, the courtroom was a battleground. James Whitmore, ever the calculating tyrant, sat stoically at the defense table, his team launching blistering attacks at every turn. They painted Eric as incompetent, reckless, and unworthy of the empire his father had built. But we had the evidence, the fraudulent transactions, the damning letters, the carefully constructed web of deceit. Piece by piece, we tore down James's facade. Eric took the stand on the final day. He spoke with emotion, detailing the years of manipulation and abuse he'd endured at his father's hands. His testimony was compelling, even moving at times, but there were moments when his performance felt a little too polished, a little too rehearsed. I watched the jury closely, noting their reactions, trying to gauge whether they were buying it. In the end, the verdict was a mixed bag. James Whitmore was held accountable for his financial crimes, fined heavily, and stripped of certain business privileges. But Eric's victory wasn't absolute. His own reputation, already tarnished by years of rumors and accusations, remained in shambles. The court didn't clear his name entirely. There were too many lingering doubts, too much smoke around the fire his father had set. Outside the courthouse, the air buzzed with reporters shouting questions and snapping photos. Eric and I stood at the edge of the chaos, watching as his father's car pulled away, flanked by security. For the first time in months, Eric looked at me with something resembling gratitude. "Thanks," he said quietly. "For everything." I studied him for a moment, searching his face for sincerity. But I didn't reply, because deep down, I wasn't sure if I'd made the right choice. Had he truly changed, or had this been just another performance, a desperate act to save himself? And even if he had changed, was it enough to make up for the person he used to be? I didn't have the answers, and maybe I never would. As Eric walked away, blending into the crowd of reporters and onlookers, I felt a strange mix of relief and unease. The case was over, but the questions it raised lingered, heavy and unresolved. Life moves forward, but some wounds never fully close. And as I stood there, watching the man who had once been my greatest tormentor disappear into the distance, I couldn't help but wonder, had I risen above him, or had I just let him win in a different way?